inviting me to this event. It was very interesting a few months ago, starting a dialogue with Ed about some of his research, which actually led, I'm sure partly because travel expenses were short, and I actually work in the next door building to this one, so it was very close. And I'm also very proud to be a director of Q here, which was a project that the City Council supported over a number of years. And I wanted really, when I'm often asked to give talks, people just assume I'm a techie, and I'm not. I'm a historian. And I'm a historian specialising in social movements. And I studied Chartism, the trade union movement, the cooperative movement, and so on in Manchester. And as somebody involved in community organising in the 70s and 80s, and some of my colleagues I work with on European projects who've actually been lucky enough to see life on Mars, often said, you know, isn't that a problem for you? This great new shiny image of Manchester, people look at life on Mars and they're reminded of a quite horrible period in time. I said, no, not at all, because actually it glamorises Manchester, and that's no bad thing, because if you were actually here in 1973 and were treated to a close-up look at the steps alongside police station, you wouldn't really think that life on Mars was that terrible, because we have come a hell of a long way in that period. And I want to actually remind us of some of that history just before I go on and talk about the future. I'm somebody who likes to think of presenting really future histories, although that's obviously a bit of a contradiction in terms. We are trying to envisage what Manchester might be like in 50 years' time. And we are then trying to think about what we do today and tomorrow. And I think I really share Phil's worry about future proofing, because I don't think we can proof anything. We can certainly think about the opportunities that might come up. But if we're proofing, and historically working in any big organisation, I work for the City Council, so I've never been a planner, thank God, but some of my best friends are. So it's really about trying to think out the box, trying to think about things we can do today that help create opportunities for tomorrow. But we still think in incredible linear things. In terms, we think of the 12-month planning process, or the 3 to 5 year planning process. In the internet world, 5 years ago, there was wide agreement that an internet year was 3 months. I mean, probably an internet year today is about 3 weeks. Now, what that actually means that in the next 50 years, certainly on the technological side, it doesn't mean that there are equal dystopian outcomes of this, as well as more utopian ideas of what could be achieved. We will potentially go through the same amount of change in 50 years than the previous 5,000 years. And that really ought to be something in terms of disruptive thinking, because these technologies are certainly disruptive, that we actually need to consider when we think about. I'm also really intrigued, also just about some of the synergies with this. I also was going to mention the Julian Temple documentary about Detroit, because one of the things I was going to talk about right at the end is actually about some of the things that the technologies of the next 50 years will enable are nothing to do with technology. They're to do with, for example, there's a lot of interest in greening the city and putting green roofs up. Some of us think, what's the point ever of putting a green roof up unless it grows food? And unless it grows food to such an extent that that can actually enter the supply chain and give you real opportunities to do things. So on the one hand, that's influenced by the so-called slow food movement, that you ought to take time out to do things. But in order to achieve that, we also have to do things incredibly fast. And, you know, remind ourselves that sometimes fast is positive change. I don't know how many people here know where the word bistro comes from. It were the field kitchens in the Napoleonic Wars for the Russian officer corps, who would shout, bistro, bistro, quick, quick, food, quick. So at times, the change in the way we work is to do with fastness. It will probably come apparent in some of the asides that I'll be making in this kind of presentation that aren't particularly too serious, that I'm also a huge science fiction fan. And one of the whole new wave of British writers who don't fixate on micro, individual relationships or the big Star Wars effect, but they write future histories. They imagine what Britain would be like after a revolution in 2050. Smart cities, creative cities. Those of you know the work of Richard Florida, you know, he talks about the go-ahead cities of the future are the ones which demonstrate talent, technology and tolerance. And we've kind of adapted that a bit, saying we think we want Manchester to be a place that celebrates creativity, innovation and diversity. And we're getting organised. Manchester is part of the Living Labs movement. This is something that started in Helsinki in 2000 with Nokia research in the Arabian Ranta area of Helsinki, which is a bit similar to Hume. It's the old working class areas around one of the new universities. And Nokia started to say, well, we're developing all these smart gadgets and we do focus groups, just like any consumer research. And, you know, we get a profile, a demographic profile of people, we give them a whizzy gadget, we ask them what they think, they come along to a focus group. Why don't we just give them these gadgets to 6,000 households in one area and see what happens? And of course what happened is things that now we take for granted in the internet, which is user-generated content, Web 2 type networking opportunities. But that idea of taking research out of the research lab and putting it in a living lab is something we subscribe to. There's now 220 living labs across Europe all working together to try and promote this. So put that together with the possibilities of the future internet. The best example, well the only example I found that works with our planners, but it worked quite well, is future internet means you can get little sensors about this big, which instead of costing 10 quid each, cost a few pence. Now you imagine an area that's subject to regular flooding. With future internet, for a few thousand quid, you could put 1,000 sensors in that area that was that suffered from flooding. Which means you could get potentially a few hours warning of the water table coming up rather than a few minutes. And you could deal with emergency situations to plan that. Further on, I've forgotten the name of the foundation now, but if people ask me about this, it's EPA, they're based in Hamburg. They're doing work on sentient buildings, new forms of concrete substitutes that absorb CO2. Another group is doing things on self-growing shells, like you get on shellfish, that can be put into rivers to group around the bottom of wooden piles. They're looking at a project to kind of save part of Venice using this technology. Now at the moment this is just all experimentation, but if we're going to go through 5,000 years of experimentation and change and realisation in the next 50, we need to get to understand this, and as a city we do need to have at least a vision for 50 years. I'm not saying it will be a plan, probably a plan for 50 years would be 10 times worse than a 5-year plan, but we need to have that vision, and that's what we're trying to do. But what we're convinced is that the future internet and the digital infrastructure as the new real estate, combined with your imagination in trying to design some of these intelligent and sentient buildings and built environments of the future, is the answer to all this. So these are just some of the key words that we would emphasise in this. And we certainly believe very strongly that although MAD in this case stands for Manchester Digital Lab, mad things really do need a mad lab, and fab things, fabrication all that, need a fab lab. So you need to facilitate people to stand aside from the day job, the academic discipline they're in, where they live, and kind of come together in very new ways. But if you do that, the open source movement, which of course from some of the greats in the IT industry like Mr. Gates said, oh, they'll never last. I mean, open source today is actually bigger than Microsoft. Not a lot of people know that because of course there's no one open source community. But it is very possible that if we do this, and to finish on my second quote that Tony Wilson always purloined from The Situationists, that in essence this new hacienda must be built. Thanks very much.